So welcome to our Catechist training video. I'm Jason Gallardo, the Director of Evangelization and Catechetical Ministries, and thank you very much for saying yes to being a catechist and helping our parents to pass on the faith to their kiddos. In this segment of the training video, we want to take a brief look at the history of catechesis and specifically how catechetical methodologies have worked in various cultures, because that's the key piece, is teaching to the culture in which our kids are living, right? And so we'll dig in a little bit more specifically into the last 100 years, but we want to take a look back even further than that. So let's go way back to the biblical age, right? In the time of the Bible, how was the faith passed on? Well, if we look in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, this might sound familiar to you. The Bible says, "Take to heart these words which I command you today. Keep repeating them to your children. Recite them when you're at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you get up." So this is immediately after the Shema prayer, right? The prayer that Jesus quotes in Deuteronomy when Pharisees and Sadducees and religious leaders ask him, what's the most important commandment in the law? And he says, love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. But then right after that is when it gets into this. Take to heart these words. Keep repeating them to your children. Moses is speaking to, God is speaking to parents, right? You have to keep repeating these things to your children. And so the expectation was good Jewish parents and good Christian parents in the early church would keep repeating these things to their children. Who is God? Who is Jesus? What does God command us to do? What did Jesus say about this thing? All right? There were no CCD classes in the first 300 years of the church. The parents were the class. It was parents passing things on to their kids. And that didn't change for a very, very long time. Even after Christianity becomes legal in early 300s AD, late antiquity, if you will, Mass was the primary mode of catechesis, unless you were a catechumen, an adult coming into the church, and then you had your catechetical classes. But in both of those things, the expectation was parents are being formed, and then they'll go home and repeat these things to their children, right? And so that's kind of the way that we've traditionally handed on the faith for a long, long time in the church. Now, when you think about, maybe you don't think about this, but some people, when they think about when the faith was best handed on, when we were at our peak, a lot of folks will think of the Middle Ages. We have this idea of the cathedral school system and all these, the Carolingian Renaissance and all these schools of handing on the faith. We think of Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica and all that. And that's all true and good, and there's a lot of good things happening there, but there's something going on in the culture in the background that we often forget. And so speaking of catechesis in the medieval period, Joseph Jungmann, a catechetical expert, says this. It's a pretty long quote, so bear with me here. He says, "We would be quite wrong if we were to attribute the flourishing of Catholic life found in all lands of Christendom at the height of the Middle Ages to the state of catechetical instruction then prevailing. For the most part, the latter consisted in a certain amount of memorizing doctrinal formulas and emphasis on questions of morality, as is evidenced by the manuals of preparation for confession, which were the forerunners of the catechism. What the children assimilated of Catholic doctrine and Christian morality they owed in main not to the schools, nor to indoctrination by the priests in the church, but at home and to the environment in which they grew up. Their training came from their surroundings, their milieu, their way of life, or whatever one wishes to call it. It came from the formative influence of a world imbued with a Christian spirit in every last detail. A child born into such a world as this had only to keep his eyes open, and he saw all around him representations of the next world. He learned about religion and its precepts and practices just as one learns one's mother tongue, spontaneously and without formal instruction, simply from contact with his environment." How about that, right? So we have these great schools and cathedrals and doctoral programs going on, all this sort of stuff, and that's not primarily what was forming. That was part of the culture. That's not primarily what was forming the kids. What was forming the kids is living in that culture and just picking up on it by osmosis in their primary context, which is their home, with their parents and the culture around them. Right? And so the home culture and the culture at large are the two key pieces in how do we pass on this faith, even in the golden age of the Middle Ages. Right? Fast forward a little bit to the time of the Reformation, right? Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli et al., right? There's something going on there that was extremely problematic that a lot of historians would point to. The fact that the Reformation happened the way that it happened, that it unfolded with large swaths of practicing Catholics being swept away by what should have been obvious heresy to them at the time, pointed to the fact that they were very poorly formed. All right, we can get into all the reasons for the Reformation, all that kind of stuff, but there was something going on catechetically at the time that just didn't work. And so after the Council of Trent, issues the Roman Catechism, one of the big catechetical moments in church history, the first formal from the Vatican level out it wasn't the Vatican at the time, right, but the top levels of the church out, Catechism of the Catholic Faith, Exposition of the Catholic Faith. They recognized then that it wasn't just about memorizing doctrine, as important as that might be, getting the doctrine correct, as important as that might be, but the introductory note printed in this catechism said a couple of interesting things. One thing they said was, the manner of communicating it is of highest importance. So in conveying religious instruction to the people, the method should be deemed of greatest importance. Not the content necessarily. Content wasn't what they said was of greatest importance. It's really important. You got to get the doctrine right. But the method, the way you deliver that is what is most important. And that's dictated by the person you're teaching, right? Their culture, their family. And that introductory note goes on to say, age, capacity, manners, and condition must be borne in mind, so that he who instructs may become all things to all men, in order that he may be able to gain all to Christ. Right? And so the culture of the individual is what is most important in trying to hand on that faith. Their family culture and the culture at large. So zooming in a little bit from kind of a broad scope of history to like the last 100 years, what has catechesis looked like, especially as the culture has shifted on us? Because in the last 100, 150 years, massive, massive upheavals. So what did this look like? You can look at what historians will call the systematic memorization period. Big academic term, right? 20th century to Vatican II in the 1960s. What did that look like in the Catholic culture at large that people were growing up in? 99% of Catholics went to church multiple times a week. Can you imagine? Not just 99% went every Sunday, multiple times a week. That's Sunday morning for Mass, Sunday evening for evening prayer. Some weekday evening for a devotional thing, right? Multiple times a week. 99% of our people were in our buildings, specifically the church building. Almost unfathomable today. Catholic families frequently prayed the rosary together. Again, almost unfathomable today, right? And no one questioned church teaching, what Father said, what Sister so-and-so said. No one questioned it. If it came out of Father's mouth, it was from the mouth of God directly almost. Right, wrong, or indifferent. Sometimes wrong, right? But that was the culture, right? Life evolves around the church. And so in that culture, how do we catechize? This is where the concept of a catechism class for children really first came out. We didn't really have these until the Industrial Revolution, right? Catechism classes for children, the CCD model, right? This was the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine was a specific international organization that you had a local chapter, almost like the Confraternity of Christian Mothers that we still have in parishes, right? You're a local body of a broader thing. And so the parish priest was always the head of the local chapter of the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, and the classes that he set up in his parish were what we called CCD, the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine. That whole system has gone away. It's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Colloquially, some of us still refer to this as CCD, but it's not, because it's not chartered, right? It's not that same thing. And so this system developed, right? We got the Baltimore Catechism in this era. After the Plenary Council of Baltimore in the United States, they asked for a local catechism to be written, and so they wrote this catechism. They put this thing out there, question-answer format, simple, memorable sorts of stuff. And so that was how we taught, was rote memorization. Even that, and even in that culture, that everything was imbued with Catholicism. And in that culture, it's easy to think all you have to do is clearly articulate the doctrine and people will just get it. The preface to the Baltimore Catechism number 4, which was an adult commentary on the Catechism, 6 years after the original Baltimore Catechism came out, the preface to that edition said this: "It must be evident to all who have experienced the work of our Sunday schools that much time is wasted in the classes. Many teachers do little more than mark the attendance and hear the lessons. This being done, time hangs heavily on their hands till the school is dismissed. The majority of our people," referring to adults, "are children as far as their religious knowledge goes." So even in this culture where you go to church multiple times a week, wouldn't dream of questioning anything the church says. I don't have any idea what they actually say about stuff, right? Even though I memorized the words, I don't know what it means, right? And so there's a problem there in catechizing that way. It didn't necessarily work in that culture. That method certainly isn't going to work in our culture right now either. So what comes after that from the 60s to the 80s was this very chaotic period, sometimes called the eclectic chaotic period, right? And that's where the culture of the church and the postmodern world is starting to take a dive quite a bit, right? This is the sexual revolution in the 60s. Question all inherited wisdom. No one who came before knows anything about what they're talking about, right? This is a period of widespread divorce and weakening of the family. So these rock-solid Catholic families who would not dream of missing Mass on Sunday all of a sudden aren't even together anymore, because mom and dad are divorced, and that brings a whole different level of questioning and confusion. And then Humanae Vitae is released in this period, Pope Paul VI document on regulation of births. And there was, especially in this country, in the United States, widespread pushback on that and outright rejection of authentic church teaching. And so now we have a culture of, instead of believe everything the church says, it's the exact opposite. Question everything the church says, because if you don't like it, you don't have to believe it. And so in that context, what do we do catechetically? We throw off the Baltimore Catechism, because again, whatever's old is stupid, let's throw it away. Not true, but that's what people thought. There was this high level of experimentation in catechesis, and this is the era that a lot of you were formed in. I remember my mom talking about being formed in this era as well. She said, my formation was Jesus loves me, put it on a banner. Right? We were just playing around with a lot of different stuff. And so there was no really systematic approach to trying to hand on the faith. It was a much simplified, really watered down catechesis because there was no authority to stand on, right? So that's why it was this chaotic period. Things started settling down a little bit into the 80s. The 80s were still a rough time. Into the 90s, right? It's more of the experimental, systematic period is what folks like to call it. Whereas Catholic culture in this period, in the 80s and 90s, Catholic identity is increasingly muddied as those being catechized in the 60s and 70s under that horrible catechetical model start having their own children, right? They're not able to pass it on because what they were given was Jesus loves me, put it on a banner. And so that's what they passed on, if they even thought it was worth passing on, right? Mass attendance starts dipping below 30%. We go from 99% multiple times a week to 30% come maybe once. And secularization of the overall culture continues. So this is eating away at this Catholic culture. So how do we start catechizing in that experimental systematic period of the 80s and the 90s? We started this approach of beginning with the student's experience, and sometimes we misunderstand what that means. Beginning by the student's experience was begin with the student's religious experience. And a student's religious experience is almost always within the context of family. Right? They experience God because they prayed as a family. They experience God because their family took them to this event. They experience God because their family went to Mass this Sunday. Their religious experience is specifically within the context of their family. Sometimes we water that concept down to, well, just what's your experience of joy and happiness and being loved somewhere? It's what's your experience of God? And that's always within the context of a family. And this time there's no clear systematic approach to content. What should we teach, let alone how should we present it? Right? We didn't really have a clear understanding of that sort of thing. And then we got new pastoral ministries starting to develop, taking parish resources and attention away from catechesis, again, right, wrong, or indifferent. There's a lot of stuff in flux here in the 80s and 90s. So by the 90s till maybe just a couple years ago, really, 2015 to 2020, if you will, we were in sort of a different period here. This was more of a systematic approach to catechesis. What's going on in the Catholic culture, or the broader culture, debatably at this point, in the late 90s into the early 2000s, we are a post-Christian culture in the United States. We have, for better or worse, thrown off the Christian culture that we were built up on. And mass attendance is now hovering around 20% in this period, which is more or less where we are right now. And so catechesis in this period starts to stress the basic beliefs. We got the content part down, right? And try to relate those to student experience. And this is honestly where probably most of us are catechizing. This is how we're trying to do it. We're still trying to stress those basic beliefs and tie it in to the kid's experience. And that's a good thing, but we're going to talk about where catechesis is heading from there. These basic beliefs, what we should actually teach, are finally concretized again at the universal level with the promulgation of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. We finally have an idea of how do all these doctrines and dogmas fit together in an organic, cohesive, systematic way that we can pass on to children and adults. And then because we have that catechism, now we've got this idea that if we're using a textbook, notice the hypothetical, if you're using a textbook, it has to be in conformity with the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It has to use that language, use that methodology, use that pedagogy, and that structure. It's not the Wild West of catechesis anymore. The experiment is over, right? So where are we now? Arguably from roughly 2015, early days of Pope Francis's pontificate, certainly by the time of the pandemic, that's a marker of a totally different era in catechesis. Where are we now? This is what the U.S. bishops are starting to call evangelizing catechesis. That's what we've got to do, is evangelizing catechesis. It used to be we thought evangelization was this pre-thing that you had to do where you got people interested in Jesus, you got them to commit to following Jesus. Once they're following Jesus and they're going to Mass and they're doing this sort of stuff, that's when you can fill their head with all the information. You guys know as well as I do, that luxury is gone. Most of the kids in your classrooms will admit, I don't ever go to Mass. My parents don't take me. They've never decided to be a Christian. They've never not even their parents. necessarily have chosen to do this thing, except for the fact that they've chosen to sign them up for these classes and bring them here an awful lot of the time, right? And so we cannot teach them we can't assume any basic formation before that. This is what the bishops are getting at. All of our catechesis of people who are all in and people who are on the periphery, all of it has to be catechesis that evangelizes, gives the basic gospel message and ties every single doctrine back into that overall message, right? And so this is this new period of evangelizing catechesis. What does that look like? What is the Catholic culture now? Younger generations now are inherently more interested in religion and tradition. Study after study after study is showing all these demographic trends. Younger people, younger priests, you've seen it in newly ordained priests, right? They all lean traditional in some capacity. They're tired of this world where we don't know anything, we're unmoored from all reality, and you make up your own universe and all this sort of stuff. They want to, give me something real, and I'll figure out if I can buy into that or not. That's what the younger generation is looking for. Children who are coming to us don't know that basic message of salvation. They don't know who Jesus is. And they don't know the main features of the overall story from creation to Jesus to the modern day. They just don't know it. They've never been presented with it. And so the way that we catechize in that culture has to be different, right? Whereas in the 50s, people wouldn't dream of not going to Mass, and they already knew all of these. There was a basic core that you could just assume was there. It's not there anymore. And so we have to understand that. There's this latent desire for sacraments without understanding why, right? Some of us have had these conversations. We marvel about this and wonder about this. Why do parents bring their kids to us for First Communion prep when they don't go to Mass? There's some latent thing in them. Maybe it's they don't want to get kicked out of the will. Maybe it's some latent Catholic identity. We're an Italian household. We've all done this. I just got to do it. It's an important thing. I don't know what it is, but it's a thing and I want the thing, right? So there's some hook there that we can capitalize on. That's part of the culture. And there's this idea of parent delegating religious instruction to the experts, you and me, right, and the father and sister and whatever. Parents have this idea, whereas before, right, remember way back at the very beginning, the biblical era, parents repeat these things to your children. Now the idea is, I'm a parent, I don't have to say any of it. I'll send them to Catholic school, I'll send them to CCD, I'll give them to father, it's not my job, I don't have to do it. And so that's the culture that we have to try to catechize kids in. So because of that, what does catechesis look like? What do the bishops say evangelizing catechesis is? Catechesis must also evangelize by presenting that basic kerygma over and over and over and over and over again. Right? Pope Francis talks in Joy of the Gospel about how we cannot get tired of repeating that basic message of Jesus because people haven't heard it, and sometimes it takes hearing it multiple times. We've got to recognize the primary role of parents, even if they are unevangelized themselves. We cannot and we will not usurp their role. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Right? Parents are primary, not just chronologically, not just because they get to their kids first because they have them and they're in the home and they're the ones teaching them to tie their shoes and walk and chew gum and this is nice behavior, this is not nice behavior. They're not just first in chronology, they're first in importance. And we'll have to drill into that as well. There's this interesting passage from the new Directory of Catechesis that came out in 2020. There's another lengthy quote, bear with me here. But it says, believing parents with their daily example of life have the most effective capacity to transmit the beauty of the Christian faith to the children. Enabling families to take up their role as active agents of the family apostolate calls for an effort at evangelization and catechesis inside the family. The greatest challenge in this situation is for couples, mothers and fathers, active participants in catechesis, to overcome the mentality of delegation that is so common, according to which the faith is set aside for specialists in religious education. This mentality is at times fostered by communities that struggle to organize family-centered catechesis, which starts from the families themselves. The church is called to cooperate with parents through suitable pastoral initiatives, assisting them in fulfillment of their educational mission to become above all the first catechesis of their own children. Right? Believing parents are the most effective tool in passing on the faith to their kids. And so if our faith formation program focuses entirely on the kids, we are going to miss the mark every time. Grace can always operate there, but we're not playing to our strengths. The parents are key. And so we have to, that's what our culture demands, that's what the kids' culture demands. We have to engage their parents and prop them up as the primary educators of their kids. And this quote talks about how sometimes communities struggle to organize themselves around family catechesis. What they mean by that is parishes. Our faith formation programs sometimes struggle to let parents take the lead. We don't show them how, we don't know how to do it, we're scared, what if they don't do it, what if they don't get it all right, all this sort of stuff. But this is what our culture demands, because the culture isn't going to teach them the faith anymore. We can get them to memorize the faith all we want. It's not going to stick if they don't have their family culture to help them survive in the garbage culture that's out there around us. So that's a snapshot of the history of catechesis. Next, we want to drill a little bit into what does it look like for parents to be the primary educators of their kids.